So for the second strategy demonstration, I am going to be explaining and describing how the activity I've chosen would be conducted in a real classroom. The activity that I've chosen is the podcast activity. What that would mean is that I would have students listen to a podcast. In this case, I have chosen to focus on using NPR as it is a pretty credible resource, and it is a source that I would like my students to utilize in the future. The idea of this activity is it focuses on listening to a podcast to help our emerging bilinguals begin to write a specific style of writing. So for the activity, it is really focusing on the writing domain, but it also utilizes components of the other ones. More specifically, the next one would be listening, as students would have to listen to the podcasts a couple of times. This is focused more towards a intermediate slash advanced level for ELD classes. It is most likely that at this point, it, when I'm talking about intermediate and advanced, it's more of high school, and so this would be more of the upperclassmen grades. So juniors, seniors, as they have been most likely been writing a general genre style, but this activity will now focus on the narrative story or writing style. So the ELP standard that this focuses on is the 9th through 12th grade standard 2. So an ELL can participate in grade appropriate oral and written exchanges of information, ideas, and analysis, responding to a peer, audience, or reader's comments and questions. The big idea for this strategy is to focus on the idea of analysis and responding, but the functions that I'll be really focusing, especially when I did the handout, is analyze and interpreting. So before reaching this lesson, I would have already shown students how to interpret text and how to connect with it, whether it be through their own stories that they imagined or even experiences. As Wright says in his book in page 225, writing also requires prior knowledge about the topic and genre. Students cannot be expected to write about a topic if they know little about it. So I don't want students to be coming into this activity without something leading to it. So I would definitely scaffold in prior lessons to lead to this point, and I would have students write in their journals for the last 10 minutes of class. And the writing could be for anything as long as they're able to continually practice that comprehension and domain. So, as I mentioned, the podcast activity will have students listen to a chosen podcast and an article as well. Both are from NPR. The podcast that I've chosen is How One Middle School in New Mexico is Teaching Kids About the World Through Opera. So, as Cador says on page 29, um, it estimates how much of the podcast they understand after listening 2 times. You can then decide whether to include podcasts at this stage of learning in their future or to find content that is more appropriate. So at this point, I would have students already been practicing the analytical and interpreting abilities. So we would cover that basis. So what I would do is, if I was to conduct this in a real classroom, I would first make sure there's a discussion. I want students to be able to listen to the podcast and hear their thoughts first. So that would be after the first listening session. And then what would happen is, I forgot to mention, but before then, there's an article that talks about what a podcast is. As some of our students might not be familiar with the term or with what it entails, I would have students know what it is, what the process is of creating a podcast, and what is normally talked about. And as they are listening or as they're reading, they're able to then analyze and again interpret what they think is most important as it leads to the podcast activity. So after that, then I would have the discussion after listening to it once, and then I would then follow Cador's strategy of listening to it again. This time, I want students to really focus on specific questions. as I have provided a few sentence starter structures for my ELD students to use when they are first, gathering their ideas before we start the process of writing the narrative. Um, so what I would do is I would create graphic organizers for my students. In a real classroom, I would use a double entry journal. So as students are listening, they are able to either summarize or by verbatim write what they heard and then be able to kind of express what they were feeling, what they were thinking, and so it can help with their writing process. And how another way that I would include this is as I am focusing in a business endorsement, um, this is a strategy that would really be beneficial. The whole process, utilizing this podcast activity as as businessmen or women, and having that business mindset, it is always important to be up to date with new information, new topics, and then be able to relate to it, be able to find common themes or be able to find common values with what was said to our own experiences. So this is definitely a activity that can be applied to many content areas. I would also follow the same process if it was conducted in a real classroom. I would have students first, read the article, be able to highlight or circle, important statements or vocabulary that they know is important to them, then be able to listen to the podcast, have a discussion about it, be able to listen. So now we are involving the listening domain, to then be able to listen to the podcast again and be able to articulate. They would be able to articulate what they are trying to relate to or what they are potentially going to be writing about, as this is more of a writing specific activity. So this is how I would use it in a classroom.